to unpack the significance of a visit by Putin to North Korea. Andy, what evidence do you think there is then of a growing military cooperation, first of all, between Moscow and Pyongyang?
Well, Stuart, the growing body of evidence we have comes from several sources, and it mainly concerns supplies of ammunition from North Korea to Russia that's then used in Ukraine. So back in March, South Korea said it had intelligence that North Korea had supplied Russia with roughly 7,000 containers that could perhaps contain ammunition and weapons. In May, in the US, the Pentagon released a report concluding that it thought that North Korean missiles had been used by Russia in Ukraine. But I think, Stuart, perhaps the most interesting evidence we have is from Ukrainian state prosecutors working on the ground in Ukraine. They say they have evidence that at least 50 North Korean missiles have been used by Russia in Ukraine. These pictures you're seeing now are fragments of a missile that Ukrainian authorities said was built in North Korea. In many cases, Ukraine says these missiles blow up in midair or simply veer off course. Now, we also have evidence from UN sanctions monitors working on the ground in Ukraine. I want to just show you a quote from a report that they produced in April when they concluded that the debris they'd covered from an impact site in Kharkiv was from a North Korean missile. They said it was very likely that it had been launched from Russian territory, which would be a clear violation of an arms embargo imposed on the regime in Pyongyang. And what's very interesting, Stuart, is that this is significantly the last report that this UN panel was able to produce before Russia vetoed a UN resolution that would have extended their mandate. Now, I want to show you another graphic now, a map that shows the route that's allegedly used by North Korea to get ammunition to Russia and then to get that ammunition closer to the front line in Ukraine. Now, the White House alleges that North Korea ships ammunition from a port in Najin to Dunay port in Russia, and then that ammunition is taken overland by rail to southwest Russia to storage sites in cities like Tikhoretsk, which would bring the munitions closer to the front lines in Ukraine. Now, why is this also worrying for Western leaders? Well, if you look at the figures of North Korea missile tests, for example, Kim Jong-un has carried out more missile tests than his father and grandfather combined. So we're seeing a ramping up of those missile tests. And the fear is that North Korea could use data gleaned from the battlefield in Ukraine to improve the performance of its weapons and its missiles back in North Korea. The other concern I think, is that by vetoing that UN resolution that would have extended the mandate of that UN sanctions team, that Russia is effectively contributing to a steady erosion of a global consensus on preventing North Korea from expanding its weapons programs.
Andy, just before we spoke to you, we heard from Yana Lee in Beijing. China, of course, North Korea's most important ally. How is Putin's visit to North Korea going down there?
Well, Stuart, first, just a bit of context. Beijing is by far Pyongyang's most important ally. Beijing effectively props up the regime in Pyongyang. So what China seeks more than anything is the status quo on the Korean peninsula. There are several ways in which Pyongyang is useful to China. One of them is that North Korea essentially acts as a buffer state between China and South Korea, where US forces are stationed. So Beijing has no interest in seeing the regime in Pyongyang fall. Now, there may be slight concerns in Beijing regarding this visit because if Russia helps North Korea accelerate its various weapons programs, the fear is that that could push the US to increase the presence of its military forces in the region. So that could lead to more instability on the Korean peninsula in what is essentially China's backyard. However, that said, Vladimir Putin was in China last month. These are pictures of his visit to China. He will have discussed this visit with Xi Jinping. Red lines would have been discussed. And essentially, the more Moscow relies on Beijing, the more leverage Beijing has over Moscow. So you can be certain that Vladimir Putin will be treading a very fine line.
Finally, Andy, I mean, some commentators are getting increasingly worried about this, I suppose, referring to Moscow's deepening ties with Pyongyang as part of a larger axis of upheaval. I mean, what do they actually mean by that, though?
Yeah, so this is a term, Stuart, that's been used by some analysts to refer to this loose grouping of countries that includes Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And it's all part of Vladimir Putin's pivot away from the West and towards the East. And what brings these countries together is less what they stand for and more what they stand against. And they all have an interest in upending the US-led international order. We see, I think, evidence of this collaboration most at its starkest level on the ground in Ukraine, where you have Russia using weapons fitted with Chinese technology, firing missiles made in North Korea, and using drones made in Iran. Something else that makes these countries very useful to Russia is their geographical proximity. For example, as you can see on this map, Iran can ship weapons directly to Russia over the Caspian Sea. So, you know, Russia also shares a border, as we've just seen there, with North Korea. It also shares a long border with China too. So, you know, corruption amongst cooperation amongst these four countries is certainly growing. You know, Russia has already worked with Iran to keep Syria's President Bashar al-Assad in power. But what the war in Ukraine has done is certainly to accelerate and deepen ties between these four countries.
We should see how it develops. Andy, thanks very much. Andrew Hilliar from our International Affairs Desk there.